Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine, a major intelligence officer, and also a weapons inspector, to discuss arms control. More specifically, the U.S. is considering sending Tomahawks to Ukraine, and yet it may also extend the START Treaty, which is the last main nuclear weapons agreement we have that is due to expire in February of next year. So welcome here to the program, and I thought it would be a good place to start with the Tomahawks. That is, well, as a weapons inspector, what are the Tomahawks and how disruptive would it actually be for the United States to send these missiles to Ukraine, I guess through Europe, but nonetheless to Ukraine?
Well, the Tomahawk is there's three variants of it that were made. There's an air-launched variant, there's a sea-launched variant, and then there's a ground-launched variant. The ground-launched variant was deployed to Europe back in the early 1980s as part of the counter force strategy taken by the United States to offset the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate range nuclear missile, road mobile. The SS-20 was seen as changing the balance of power in Europe, giving the Soviets tremendous amount of advantage, and we needed to counter it. So we deployed two systems: the Pershing II, which is a solid rocket um, missile, very capable, very accurate. And we also deployed the ground launch cruise missile, the Tomahawk. Um, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed because what the world recognized is that these weapon systems of intermediate range um, were extraordinarily destabilizing, especially when deployed in Europe. And if you wanted to have a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, then these were the perfect weapons to deploy because the instability regime created would inevitably spin out of control. So President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev wisely, in December of 1987, signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It went into force in July of 1988, and we got rid of them, eliminated them. The air-launched variant was still there. I know it very well. During the Gulf War in 1991, the first combat use of the air-launched cruise missile was used to strike initially the Taji Iraqi missile production facility. And there was the sea-launched version, which everybody has seen fired from ships and come out of the water from submarines. And it, again, played a very important role in the early moments of Desert Storm and just about every American military operation since. But the ground-launched version was gone, eliminated, until Donald Trump decided that he was going to pull out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which he did in August of 2019, citing a manufactured case. At least that's my assessment. The case that we made against the Russians, that they were, fielding a system, the 9M729. We claim to have intermediate range in excess of 500 miles. And the Russians denied it, did their best to try and prove otherwise, but we pulled out because we wanted to pull out. And the reason why I wanted to pull out is that we wanted to deploy the Tomahawk in a ground launch variety. Within weeks of pulling out, we did the first test of the ground launch Tomahawk, fired from what's called a Mark 41 pod, Aegis Ashore, the same system that's used on ships and also used, by the way, in Poland and in Romania as part of their so-called ballistic missile defense shield. Can also launch missiles like the Tomahawk that are ground attack missiles. And so here we are. It's back in system. It is not, I mean, there is a nuclear variant. Obviously, we're not providing that to anybody except maybe the British, but even then, I don't think so. But the Tomahawk's best known for its conventional payload, its ability to strike accurately over long distances. But it's a hyped up system. I'll just be honest with you. There's certain things that I'm allowed to talk about and certain things I'm not allowed to talk about. One of the things I'm still not allowed to talk about is the accuracy of the Tomahawk during Desert Storm. You can put two and two together as to maybe why they wouldn't want to talk about the specific effectiveness of that system. But we have even though they've improved the Tomahawk over time in terms of improved guidance, taking advantage of new technologies. When the Tomahawk was used against Syria, and again by Donald Trump and another hyped up thing, it didn't perform well. The majority of them were shot down or missed their targets. The Tomahawk's just not a very good system. And you need a lot of Tomahawks to destroy a facility. Again, I mentioned the Taji missile facility north of Baghdad for a reason, because we blanketed it with Tomahawks, scores of them, and we never fully destroyed it. Um, so it's a system that has some capability, but when it comes to actual physical destruction um, of facilities, it's just not that effective. We fired 35 of them most recently against Iran, I believe, targeting missile sites in Isfahan or nuclear sites in Isfahan with little or no effect. Um, so here's that system. It's now up for export. The United States, always looking to make a penny, has decided that it wants to export the Tomahawk. Before, I think ourselves and the British were the only ones who used it. Now the talk is to send it to Japan and the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is the important party here because, as you have indicated, the Tomahawk wouldn't be provided directly by the United States to Ukraine. It would be sent through a European intermediary, through a NATO country. And the Dutch have, they have, I think, concluded a contract. They've done their operational testing. A Tomahawk has been fired from a Dutch frigate. And the Dutch are in line to buy a couple of hundred of these things. Delivery expected to begin in 2028. And so when we talk about providing the Tomahawk to Ukraine, it would be through a European intermediary, and the Dutch seem to be the most likely candidates because they're the only European power besides the British to be purchasing the Tomahawk. Any other European nation coming up, you'd have to get in line. And Ukrainians would never see that weapon system. But this is where we're at. It can reach out and touch people 1,500 miles accurately. But as President Putin mentioned in Valdai, the very discussion group we were at, it's an old system, and they can shoot it down, and it's not a game changer. It really isn't a game changer, unless it strikes political targets. I mean, as a weapon system to degrade, the only reason why Ukraine would want this is to, for instance, you see a lot of talk now about using the Tomahawk or a Tomahawk-like system to take out the drone production facility near Kazan. You would need to take out that facility effectively. You would need over 60 Tomahawk missiles to strike that facility. It isn't going to be done with one or two. You would need 60, and even then, there's no guarantee. To strike other facilities, for instance, if you want to take out the Vodkinsk missile assembly plant where the Russians are pumping out the Iskander-S's, they're pumping out the Oreshnik, they're pumping out other systems, strategic as well, you would probably have to strike that facility with well over 100 Tomahawks. And even then, there's no guarantee of success. It's just not that effective of a system.
But when the discussions were about the destabilizing nature of these Tomahawks, again, during the Cold War, still then, the main premise was that this would be primarily functioning as a deterrent, but the concern would be that they could be employed in a first strike, something along those lines. But this time, we're talking about using them actively in a war against Russia. That is, we see Western leaders talk about the need to send long-range missiles, assist them with it in order to strike energy facilities, weapons production facilities, some even calling for political targets. So it is very different. This is a I mean, when do we cross the line between proxy war and direct war? Trump used to be opposed to this. I remember he was quite vocal against Biden's sending the ATACMS, as this was definitely one step too far. And even in the Oval Office, he, when he was yelling at Zelensky, he was warning, that he's playing with World War III here. What happened to the caution? I mean, Trump used to understand the severity of this, and now it seems very casual to talk about the need to send Tomahawks. I guess, which also takes me to my question about the involvement of U.S. troops. To what extent is it necessary to have U.S. or perhaps Dutch troops to assist the Ukrainians with this weapon system? In other words, when do we cross that line to a direct war?
Glenn, with all due respect, we've crossed that line already. We are at war with Russia. We just don't acknowledge it. But it's a war. The Russians know this. They've made statements to that effect. And even Marco Rubio says we are in a proxy war with Russia. That's a war. We are direct participants in this conflict, and we have been for some time now. The Tomahawk, however, would be literally a bridge too far. First of all, it's a nuclear-capable system. The deterrent factor that it had back in the 1980s wasn't because it delivered a conventional payload, it's because it delivered a nuclear payload. During the Cold War, when the Tomahawk was first deployed to Europe in a ground-launched version, it was a nuclear-capable system, and that's what made it so dangerous. And it could be used to participate in a first strike. There was actually a plan in place to use the Pershing II to decapitate Soviet leadership, command and control, and then the Tomahawk combined with Trident missiles launched from Ohio-class submarines, operating close to shore on a reduced trajectory, would seek to destroy as much of the Soviet, nuclear missiles as possible to create an inevitability of defeat. Classic first strike. This has made it so destabilizing, and that's why the decision was made to get rid of them. But now, when you have to ask yourself, if you're a Russian and you see a Tomahawk being fired at you from Ukraine or from anywhere, how do you know it's not nuclear? How do you know it's not part of this decapitation? If you go back to December of 2021, when the Russians were talking to the Biden administration about Ukraine, the Russians made it clear over and over again that the one thing that they worried about more than anything else was NATO long-range missiles based on Ukrainian soil. You see, Ukraine is like a fist in the Russian womb. All the Russian strategic infrastructure was, designed during Soviet times and placed during Soviet times when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And so, where the Russian facilities are and capabilities are, bases are, was considered to be part of a strategic depth. It would take some effort to get from, NATO countries through the Warsaw Pact into the Soviet depth. Because remember, it wasn't just Ukraine, but you had the whole buffering states of Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. They all provided a buffer too in terms of, space. And now, NATO expansion has brought NATO right up to the Russian borders. And now with Ukraine, you just come in and literally all of the Russian strategic depth is now exposed. And the Russians said, we can't allow NATO to put long-range strike capabilities in there. And the Biden administration would not commit to not doing this. So literally the Tomahawk is the Russian nightmare coming true. And the Russian nuclear doctrine is quite specific that if a non-nuclear state is empowered by a nuclear state to strike Russia, then Russia will treat it as an attack by a nuclear state and respond with the full capacity of its capabilities, which is nuclear. And so we need to acknowledge right up from the start that any use by Ukraine of Tomahawk missiles would bring about a possible Russian nuclear response, especially if they struck political targets. Could you imagine a Tomahawk missile hitting the Kremlin, hitting St. Basil's, hitting the Bolshoi Theater, hitting St. Petersburg. Imagine what would happen if the Russians provided caliber missiles to Venezuela, and then the Venezuelans fired them, and they struck the Capitol, they struck the White House, they struck the Smithsonian. Um, you think the United States would go, oh, well, it's just war? Or would we not only eliminate Venezuela forever, but probably eliminate the Russians as well for facilitating this attack? Because I would imagine that the caliber missile could not be fired without assistance, targeting assistance, technical assistance from Russian technicians. The question now is, can that Tomahawk be operated by Ukraine, without assistance? The version of the Tomahawk that the United States employs that has access to satellites, GPS satellites, radar satellites, imaging satellites that provides real-time updates. This cannot be operated by anybody other than Americans, because first of all, the communications systems are all heavily encrypted, and the keying material is closely guarded secret, protected by the National Security Agency and other defense security agencies, and it will not be shared with anybody. These are the most closely held secrets in the United States, and so. And the other thing is the packaging. For instance, the terrain following technology. That strike package, the mapping is prepared by a special American Department of Defense activity that uses American intelligence information to do this, and that nobody else in the world can replicate that. So if you're using Terracom, that means you're using American intelligence specifically configured for the target that you're striking, which means America is now targeting Russia, in effect. The same thing with the GPS. It's military-grade GPS, which is in encrypted communications. If you used commercial-grade GPS, the Russians would jam it. The missile would be stupid. And then finally, the final guidance that goes in is imaging matching. Images are stored inside the Tomahawk, and then as it comes in, it scans and it's looking for a match, and it finds the match and then does the final maneuver to hit the target. That's again imagery provided by the United States system. Again, that cannot operate without the United States. So the American version of the Tomahawk could not be provided to Ukraine without the Americans running the whole show. I mean, maybe a Ukrainian finger would push the launch button, but everything else would be the United States. So it would be the United States literally attacking Russia. The export version, by necessity, would have to be dumbed down. To what extent it would be dumbed down, I don't know. Nobody's come out and said that. I do know that Congress has provided waivers for the missile technology control regime so that the Tomahawk could be exported. And one would imagine that there would be a degradation of capabilities that the United States in selling the weapons system to another nation, even a NATO nation, would have to configure it so that it could be controlled by just that NATO nation. And then the question is that transferable to Ukraine? Meaning that if you can dumb it down for the Dutch, can the Dutch just transfer it to the Ukrainians and give the Ukrainians a similar level of dumbed down training that they had? These things aren't known yet, but it doesn't matter, because the moment a Tomahawk is launched against Russia, the Russians have no choice but to assume that it's a nuclear capable missile and will have to act accordingly.
Well, if it's known that this is will be seen as a U.S. attack on Russia, that this, as you said, is the worst nightmare for Russia, given they don't know what kind of payload is carrying, and indeed could for this reason trigger a nuclear response from Russia. Why do we have people like General Keith Kellogg, which seems, I would say, overly eager to have the Tomahawks sent to Ukraine? I mean, when they're all in a group together, patting each other on the back, saying, well, this is just Ukraine defending themselves. It's not as if we've been, engaged in a proxy war against Russia for the past decade. Surely they must know what risk they're running here. Why are they so eager? Is this desperation, or are they stuck in a bubble? It's very hard to understand why we would, after going through the whole Cold War now, almost pushing for a direct war with the Russians.
Well, there's two things. One is desperation. We're losing. We're losing bad. We gambled everything on the belief that the Russians wouldn't be able to survive sanctions, the Russians wouldn't be able to survive diplomatic isolation, and that the Russians didn't have the military capacity to, um, you know, sustain this conflict. We were hoping that the Russians would collapse, literally collapse. I mean, the whole purpose of this campaign was to bring about economic collapse that would bring about societal collapse that would bring about political collapse. This is a regime change operation that's being run, part and parcel of a policy that's been in place since Vladimir Putin was won his first election. I mean, there was a period of time between um, Yeltsin appointing him on New Year's Eve, 1999, and Putin winning the election in March of 2000, where we believed that he was just a figurehead, placeholder that we could manipulate the Russian political system as we had previously with Boris Yeltsin, and put somebody in that would be more to our liking. But when Putin won the election very narrowly, by the way, people can think he's a dictator. He's a democratically elected guy, won by a very narrow margin. Um, we didn't know what to do. And so we began a policy of containment. How do we contain? Because see, we had Russia where we wanted them, down with our foot on their throat. How do we continue this with a guy that we didn't pick? And so we've been struggling with Putin ever since then. And the Obama administration, straight up, the Russian reset. You remember that famous red button that Hillary Clinton pushed and giggling with, Sergei Lavrov, was a regime change operation. The whole purpose of the reset was to keep Vladimir Putin out and keep Dmitry Medvedev in. That was it. That's the only reason why it happened. And when it failed, when Putin came back, we doubled down. Nemtsov, Navalny, all of the CIA operations, 100% straight up CIA operations designed to undermine, the Russian political system, to create an opposition, not because we believed in democracy, but because we wanted to bring down Vladimir Putin. And we've been, embarked on this ever since. And the special military operation was, the basically the Russians saying no to a whole bunch of stuff. But so this is a regime change operation, and it has failed. Vladimir Putin today is stronger than he has ever been. I mean, anybody who thought that this man would wilt, you saw him, 4 hours. The brain works. The brain is attached to 25 years of experience of rebuilding Russia, of leading Russia out of the ashes to this position of global prominence. This is the last place the people who were gunning for Putin wanted him to be, and so there is a sense of desperation that they have failed in the architecture that was supposed to facilitate the demise of Russia, NATO, the European Union, the rules-based international order, the G7, the G20. It's all falling apart. And the United States is recognizing that its role as, unmatched global hegemon is over. We are transitioning, whether we like it or not, to a multipolar system where Russia is playing a major role. And we always feared what would happen if Russia and China got together. Well, Russia and China have sort of gotten together. And so we're gambling that we can still bring Putin down. And that, you see this. I mean, Gilbert Doctorow, I know you know him. He has talked about a coup, Russian elites being. This is just nonsense. This is Western fantasy land. There is no coup being plotted. There are no disenchanted elites plotting against Vladimir Putin. This is just an absurdity in extreme. But it's this kind of thinking that empowers the Keith Kellogg's and the Marco Rubios and the Pete Hegseths and the other Russophobes who surround Donald Trump, because they need to believe that there's a chance for victory. They can't accept the inevitability of Russia's, Vladimir Putin, walking away a victor in this. And so they are convincing themselves that by taking these actions, they will bring down Russia. I mean, Doctorow Tomahawk hits Moscow, and it's it. Putin collapses, folds like a house of cards. It's over. He's out of here. It's done. No, the world ends. But there's that aspect of it too. But this ties into something else that's even more dangerous. There is a feeling that Russia is bluffing, that Russia is basically holding a pair of twos and betting like they're holding a royal flush. That when it comes time to call the hand, Russia's not going to be holding the cards and will have to fold. Um, that they're overplaying this. And a large part of the reason why people believe this is because of the maturity of Vladimir Putin and not overreacting to all the provocations, um, and the reticence of Russia to escalate unnecessarily. Russia, has taken insults and hits that would prompt Western nations to react in a different manner. But Russia instead has absorbed this, much to the frustration of many people in the West who are like, why is Russia taking this? Why is Putin not? Because they're winning. The bottom line is they're winning across the board. Russia's not losing any aspect of this confrontation, this proxy war with the West. They're winning every aspect of it. And Putin's confidence in his 4-hour presentation at Valdai certifies this, that, he is a man who is confident of where Russia is and where Russia's going, and he's confident of Russia's capabilities. But people inside the Trump administration believe that he's bluffing, that all we have to do is call his bluff. And so that's why they're pushing for this. They're crossing red lines that any rational player would never cross. One of the reasons why they do this is that they have been infected with Russophobia. And Russophobia literally deadens the brain about the reality of Russia. Russophobia prevents you from having a realistic assessment of Russia. The CIA is thoroughly infected with Russophobia. You saw this in 2016 with the nonsense of Russiagate and how the CIA orchestrated this, deliberately manufacturing or exaggerating or misrepresenting intelligence for political purposes, because they believe in their heart of hearts that Vladimir Putin was an evil, dictatorial autocrat who had to be removed for the good of the world. And two, that the Russians couldn't back up their posturing, that if we just pushed the Russians, they would collapse. And so here we are with the CIA advising the president that Russia's weak. He's surrounded by people who are saying the Russians are bluffing. And most importantly, the president's embarrassed. You see, he put a lot of political capital in bringing this Ukrainian-Russian conflict to an end. He said he could do it. He implied that all he had to do is pick up a phone and the world would come to it. And now he's embarrassed. He's got mud on his face. And embarrassed, he's looking for face-saving ways out of this. And he's surrounded by people who are saying, peace through strength, Mr. President, peace through strength. You must be strong. And the Russians are bluffing. Putin's not as strong as he thinks he is. He's taken more casualties than he's admitting. They're not capable of producing what they produce. They are an oil-based economy. All we have to do is strangle their oil and they will collapse like a house of cards. And he's getting all of this Russophobic advice, and nobody who knows anything about Russia's in his orbit. I mean, Steve Witkoff has a window into the reality of Russia through Kirill Dmitriev and his occasional meetings with Vladimir Putin. But Witkoff's not a good conduit because Witkoff can't translate Russian reality into effective advice for Donald Trump. Witkoff is simply a tool used by Donald Trump to send messages to Russia, but he's not a very good conduit for receiving messages and accurately portraying the Russian reality. And so we have a president who literally lives in La La Land right now, who is agreeing to things because he believes that it's effective policy, and he believes that Russia is weaker than it is, and he believes that Russia is bluffing.
Well, there was, Gorbachev. He didn't shy away from criticizing Putin, but he also recognized, though, that if it hadn't been for Putin, Russia might have collapsed in the 2000s. So essentially crediting him for saving, the nation. So no, I don't see a regime change or a coup going away, coming along anytime soon. But I guess
Just a quick observation.
yeah.
When was the last time you saw a coup take place in a country where the leader had over 80% support?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's even if one would get rid of him, what is the stable alternative? It wouldn't be great for Russia, but I guess my point is it wouldn't be great for us either. Every time we, daydreaming away of getting rid of Vladimir Putin, we seem to be envisioning him being replaced by another Yeltsin, some liberal softy who will do as they're told. But the main pressure which would come, or frustration which would come towards Putin, appears to be that his restraint is being interpreted as weakness in the West. So he didn't do anything significant in retaliation against the HIMARS, F-16, etc. So his main opposition would be some very hawkish figures. I always advocate that perhaps we think this one through before we start acting on our daydreams about replacing President Putin. But it does take me though to the Europeans. I mean, we talked a bit about Americans being irresponsible, but for the Europeans, they seem to be in a dilemma because at some levels they recognize that the Tomahawks can trigger World War III. If we let the START treaty go, it could lead to nuclear war. Yet, if we bring the US into a war with Russia, that's the one thing that could rescue this dire situation. So they recognize the dangers of escalating. On the other hand, well, what's the alternative? We can't lose. We bet everything on this war. How do you see this playing out? Because, well, overall, I guess the transatlantic relationship with the US, it depends on a Russian adversary, but making Russia an enemy also makes Europe less prosperous, makes it less secure, and also less relevant in the world. So it's not a great security architecture because we keep to hold on to NATO. We end up redividing the continent, remilitarizing it, and weakening ourselves, making ourselves more dependent on the United States, which frankly would like to set its sights on more interesting parts of the world. Do you see NATO surviving this war?
No, I don't see the EU surviving this war. I don't see Europe surviving this as it's currently configured. Um, Look, there's a couple things that mitigate against Europe's enormously dangerous posture today. One is that the United States doesn't want a war with Russia. I mean, Donald Trump has made it clear that this is Europe's problem. I mean, even Kelly Kalas, who is just, you know, noted for being perhaps even more dense than, Baerbock. Um, she recognizes that the United States has washed its hands of the Ukrainian conflict, and it's on us, and we can't do it. We can't do it. And one by one, you start to see Europeans wake up to the reality of what's happening here and the damage that's been done. I mean, Germany is a basket case economically. France is a basket case politically. The United Kingdom is collapsing as we speak. Um, you know, the 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 idea that Europe's going to be able to drag the United States into this war is an absurdity. Even if, again, let's look at the Tomahawks, unless something radically changes where Trump says, I'm giving them American Tomahawks with American support personnel. No, but that goes against everything he said. It said it's going to go through a NATO partner. It's not going to be American. That means the timelines are such that we're not talking reality. It's like with the ERAM missile that we talked about earlier. You know, it's October. They've produced one prototype. That's it. Where's the 3,200 they're going to rain death and destruction down on Russia? They don't exist. And they're not going to exist for some time. And Ukraine isn't going to last that much longer. I mean, Vladimir Putin mentioned in Valdai, he said, look, this war is simple. We just kill their soldiers and they can't replace their soldiers. And at some point in time, they collapse. And that's the Russian strategy, to wait this thing out. Politically, all Russia has to do is continue to do that. Kill Ukrainian soldiers in prodigious amounts, which they're doing as we speak, and wait for it. It doesn't matter what kind of weapon systems are provided, because if there's no Ukrainians to man these systems, then it just doesn't matter. And literally, that's what Vladimir Putin said. But the other thing is, the longer we wait, the more fractured Europe becomes. I mean, there is a growing reality that many of these governments aren't going to be around this time next year. I mean, France just lost its sixth, maybe seventh prime minister in 2 years. It's non-functioning government. How long can Macron continue to stay on? At some point in time, you know, reality dictates he'll have to resign and hold snap elections for the presidency, and he'll be gone. And when he's gone, he will be replaced by somebody who will not pursue, irresponsible French policies. Keir Starmer is likewise history. Um, how long can Merz hang around? I mean, the man is just saying, we're going to cut all your pensions. We're going to change life as you know it because my government doesn't know how to make sound policies. Oh, by the way, we want you to pay billions of dollars to Ukraine for this war that can't be won. Uh, Europe, NATO can't survive. NATO doesn't have the ability to reconstitute an atrophied military system. There's not enough money in the world to do this, especially the way NATO operates. They don't have good unified procurement. They don't have, the kind of training, the focus, the leadership, anything. They have coasted for the past 4 decades on America, having American back them up. Today, though, what can NATO do on its own? The answer is literally nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And it's too expensive to fix. Look at the Germans, 100 billion euros in 2022 to bring the German army up to standard so it could stand up to the Russians. And last year they had to go in for more money because that 100 billion was gone. They hadn't made the military, they hadn't made a dent. There's not enough money to fix Europe's military problems as long as NATO is the problem. If you want to fix European military posture and European military capabilities, then the individual nation states must decouple themselves from NATO and focus on the legitimate defense requirements of that state. And that may require them to look to nations to their left and their right and do joint work together. But this concept of 30 nations working hand in glove is absurd. It's a fantasy, it's a fiction. So NATO is collapsing. When Mark Rutte became the Secretary General, I said he will be the last Secretary General of NATO. That prediction may in fact come true because as the European Union collapses, so too does NATO. And the European Union is collapsing as we speak. You can only buy an election so many times. We saw the European Union buy an election in Romania. We saw them buy an election in Moldova. Couldn't buy an election in the Czech Republic. And they're not going to buy an election in Germany or in France, or they couldn't buy the election last time in Poland. So it's over. It's game, set, match. Europe is collapsing. All Russia has to do is wait this puppy out.
Yeah. Well, I was at Valdido, and one thing I heard from many, well, especially foreign generals, even Indian ones, and ambassadors, was the lack of understanding for what Russia did. You mean what it's doing in the war? Some were questioning why they're not doing what the Americans were attempting to do in Iran, that is to launch a decapitation strike, because it seems as if Russia would be in a position to do so. Well, as it suggested, this war of attrition is very gruesome by nature, as you said, just degrading and wiping out the military of the opponent. So, well, how do you see this? How do you explain that the Russians just continue to degrade the military of the Ukrainians and doesn't go for a decapitation strike?
When I was invited to Russia in August, I went there I was hosted by the National Unity Club. And the National Unity Club is affiliated with the Union State. And the Union State is a political economic structure that brings Belarus and Russia together. But every conversation that was held through the National Unity Club, and about the Union State is they spoke of the three sisters. See, the Union State won't be whole until a third sister joins. And the third sister is Ukraine. The West doesn't understand this because our mentality is we're at war, kill. That's what we do. I can guarantee you, America, there wouldn't be a Ukrainian government today. There wouldn't be a Ukraine today. We'd have blown it into the ashes. Doesn't mean we necessarily win because we always find a way to lose, but we would have destroyed Ukraine. The Russians Ukraine is the third sister. You don't kill your sister. Your sister's gone astray, but you want the sister to come back and rejoin the family. And that's always been the goal and objective. I mean, Western Ukraine creates a quandary because it's not orthodox. It doesn't share the same value system as you know the traditional Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. The Slavic trilogy. Western Ukraine is an aberration, political, etc. That problem will have to be resolved one way or the other. If you go with Narishkin and what he was talking about earlier in the summer, give it to the Poles. No better way to take care of Banderism than to give it to the Poles who hate the Banderists. But the goal isn't to destroy Ukraine. The goal is to get rid of this Ukrainian nationalist government that has sold itself out to the West. Um, but the goal was always and remains, I believe, to bring Ukraine back into the fold of the Slavic umbrella. The third sister returns home. Um, and if you see it from that perspective, then you understand why there hasn't been decapitation. Because to decapitate, you would have to take out Bankova Street. You'd have to destroy Kiev. Kiev is a hero city. The hero city of the war that the Russians, acknowledge every victory day. The role played by Ukraine in defeating Nazi Germany, the pain suffered by Ukraine because of Nazi Germany is understood by everybody. And so the idea that Russia would turn on its sister when the sister has been led astray by the West it may be difficult for people in the West to understand, but it's not difficult for Russians to understand.
Well, just a last question to finish on a positive note, perhaps. We'll see. But the START treaty, that is, Putin suggested this nuclear treaty, which is due to expire in new START treaty, due to expire in February. Again, this is what limits the nuclear weapons on each side. This could spark a nuclear arms race, which would, well, it shouldn't be political for. Again, this is just horrible for the whole world. First, it seemed as if he didn't get any response at all. But now Trump appears to have signaled that he appreciates the offer. I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. Do you see any future or any possibility now in extending the new START treaty, at least buying one more year to prevent nuclear Armageddon, or what's standing in the way of this?
Well, first of all, the START treaty is dead. It will expire on February 5th, and it will not be extended. That's not what Putin's offering. The Russians were ready to receive an offer from the United States to extend New START, but that required the United States to change its attitude. Russia's not going to engage in strategic arms control with a nation that seeks the strategic defeat of Russia. And that was the Biden administration's policy, the strategic defeat of Russia. And that's why basically the New START treaty stopped being implemented. Nobody broke out of the constraints, but there's no inspection regime. There's no exchange of data. There's nothing that makes the treaty work. And the Trump administration, frankly speaking, hasn't been active in this regard. In fact, it's done the worst. Back in July 25th, Donald Trump said, this New START's a treaty we can't allow to expire. Too late, Mr. President. It's going to expire. But why didn't he take any action on that? Well, because on July 19th, 6 days prior, Marco Rubio gutted the State Department, gutted it. 1,300 positions removed. Many of these were people who would be involved in, monitoring treaties and negotiating new treaties. The people who interact with the Russians, they no longer are employed. And moreover, the offices and departments the bureaus that would, take the lead on something like this have been consolidated. I mean, the guy who would normally be running, arms control negotiations now also is responsible for counterterrorism and counter narcotics. How do you make arms control a priority there? Arms control is always the toughest thing to sell to people because it doesn't have the immediacy of, 9/11 or, Venezuelan drug smugglers running through the oceans. It's this esoteric thing. And now the person is supposed to sell this esoteric concept of arms control to the president. is also running a potential war against Venezuela and, counterterrorism operations in the Middle East, and et cetera. There's nobody doing the job right now. Nobody. And you saw the Russian ambassador to the United Nations came out and said, there's just literally nothing happening, nothing coming from the United States on this. So Vladimir Putin, recognizing this, I think on September 22nd, said, "Look, we'll offer a moratorium, a 1-year moratorium. The treaty's dead, finished. But we will keep the caps in place, 1,550 for a year. And during that year, if the United States wants to engage with us, we'll be more than happy to engage." Um, you know, but one of the other things that the Trump administration's made difficult is the Russians are ready to have bilateral negotiation with the United States. But, Trump has said, "Oh, the Chinese have to be brought in." The Russians are like, "Well, if you want China to come in, talk to—" I mean, this is what Putin just said. "If you want China to come in, you talk to China." But understand that if you're broadening it that way, then the United Kingdom and France, who are NATO members, by the way, and are extending their nuclear umbrella into Europe, that comes onto the table. And then other things, missile defense, comes onto the table. And then Putin said, "And if you give Tomahawks to Ukraine, that sort of ends it all right there. There won't be." And so there's no easy way out of this. The Trump administration, Donald Trump said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea," but who's advising him? Because I don't think he could take it to the next step. Why is it a good idea, Mr. President? Why is it a good idea? Because I know the president's been briefed on what happens on February 6th if the treaty goes away and the moratorium isn't there. The Minutemen III, oh, by the way, just so everybody understands, the Sentinel missile was supposed to replace the Minuteman III by 2030. It's dead in the water. Can't afford it, doesn't work. And so now we're going to extend the life of the Minuteman III until 2050. Now, one of the key aspects of the Minuteman III, it used to be a 3-warhead system. And because of New START and another earlier version of START, we dropped it down to a single warhead. Now, we have tested the Minuteman III on several occasions in the past with 3 warheads just to prove that the system could do it. But Congress has been briefed that if New START goes away, the Minuteman III will instantly be upgraded to a 3-warhead system. We have 450 Minuteman III deployed right now. That's 450 warheads. Now we instantly see that number triple. The same thing with the Trident. We took the Trident down to a certain number. We would see every Trident missile have increased warheads on it. So we would literally quadruple or quintuple the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons overnight. And the Russians can't just allow that to happen in a vacuum, but they have built their systems. The interesting thing is we're talking about the Trident, which is, been around for decades. We're talking about the Minuteman III, which is older than the people who operate it. We don't have any new modern system. The B-21 we can't afford. But the Russians, on the other hand, they have Sarmat, a heavy ICBM that will approach us not over the North Pole, but through the South, where we have no defenses, no detection. They have Avant-Garde, which is mounted on, the Yars and the Topo-M and others, hypersonic reentry vehicles, nuclear capable. They're building a whole new generation of missiles, the Cedar missile, the Osnia missile, with new warheads, new technology, all of which is designed to defeat current and future missile defense systems. As Putin said, we're very comfortable with what we have. We're happy where we are. We can survive without this treaty. We're ready. So Russia's ready. Russia's already configured itself to maintain nuclear deterrence capability in a post-New START environment. America's not. We will be panicking, trying to bring in older systems, et cetera. And from weakness comes stupidity. We see this. We just talked about it with the decision to deploy the Tomahawk. The United States will be entering a nuclear arms race with Russia from a position of severe weakness, and that can't lead to anything good happening. Bad decisions were made all around. So even if we get a year extension, which we have to have, by the way, I mean, if we don't do this, we're going to die. I just want to make that point clear because this administration doesn't have, um, you know, as we see with Ukraine, the wisest people advising the president. Um, and they will see from Russia strength that has to be matched with strength. And since we don't have the strength to match it, we will match their strength with posturing. We'll be the ones running around trying to because we believe the Russians are bluffing. And incidents will occur, mistakes will be made, miscalculations, misjudgments. And then there will be a nuclear exchange. And so people understand the Biden administration was ready to have a nuclear war with Russia last fall, straight up ready. They wanted that war. They said, we're ready for it. The ATACMS decision to sign off on the ATACMS in November to strike targets in the depth, the CIA said there's a 51% chance or greater that Russia will respond with nuclear weapons. And the Biden administration response wasn't, oh, they're bluffing, they'll never do it. It was, let them do it. We're ready. We'll win. We'll win that war. Of course, the man who said we'll win, uh, Thomas Buchanan was his name, the Rear Admiral with the Strategic Command. He also said, maybe we need to be honest with the American people about what winning means because it isn't going to be what you think it is. Society will be destroyed. Everything will be destroyed. We'll have a government in place. Democracy will be dead. And the things you enjoy in life today will no longer exist. That's winning. And anytime I hear an American military officer talk about winning and accepting that victory means the defeat of American democracy, then I have to ask, what are you defending? And why are we going to war? And that's the absurdity of nuclear war. And the Trump administration is carrying on this. Remember, when we talk about the deep state, we talk about the establishment, it's real. The people who created the perception that we could win a nuclear war under the Biden administration are still in the establishment today, still in the CIA, still in in the military, still in the whole academia, the think tanks, everybody that's part of this nuclear enterprise. They're still there. That mindset still exists, and these are the people advising this president. So if we get into a situation where the United States is on its back foot, perceived to be weak, and we have to posture ourselves out of this, and the president is confronted with the decision, if you do this, there might be a nuclear war. He's being told we can win. I can't. And and that also he's being told it can be contained. We can have a limited nuclear exchange. No, you can't. Every war game that's ever war gamed a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia has never ended with, oh, okay, we dropped just enough nuclear weapons, let's call it quits. It ends with a total exchange of nuclear capability and the world disappears. This is where we're at. This is a very, very dangerous situation. Vladimir Putin's offered not just the United States, but the world a 1-year moratorium on certain death. The question is, not only is what America going to do, Congress passed a resolution, or not passed, the Republicans, after hearing Biden's insanity, submitted a resolution to the Foreign Affairs Committee to prohibit the transfer of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine and prohibit the provision of intelligence used to guide these things. They said, but it's because this would lead to war. Well, we need Congress to do the same thing for the Tomahawks today. Basically tell the president, no, you can't sell Tomahawks. We won't allow it, and we won't allow you to give intelligence. We need Congress to take action. But we also need America's allies to take action. America's allies, Europe has to say, this is suicide. This is stupid. This is bad. Europe needs to understand that it never owned Ukraine, and it's never going to own Ukraine. Ukraine was never theirs and will never be theirs. So drop the fantasy. You're not losing anything. You never had it. It never belonged to you. So why are you committing suicide to, on behalf of something that was never yours? Europe needs to save itself. But to save itself, it has to stop this insanity. It has to promote arms control instead of the United Kingdom and France trying to become a third superpower. They need to basically recognize the destabilizing reality of their independent nuclear forces, and they have to be willing to put that on the table as part of an overall, negotiated settlement between Russia and the United States. Russia's ready to do this, but the Ukraine war has to finish in Russia's favor. The United States and Europe have to stop their policies of seeking to bring down Vladimir Putin and destroy Russia, learn to live in peaceful harmony with Russia, if not as friends, at least not as enemies. And then the structures of nuclear deterrence could be adjusted to this new reality. But without that, we're going to enter an arms race, and the end doesn't look too good.
Yeah, this seems we should really reconsider this objective of the strategic defeat of Russia, the world's largest nuclear power, before we destroy the world. Is quite shocking what we're willing to risk in this proxy war. Anyways, thank you as always for being so generous with your time, and this is and warning us. I think this is a very dangerous period of time, and it's a bit concerning how nonchalant and non-caring the world seems to be about the path we're going down at the moment. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you can come on again some other time.
If we're alive.
All right.
Glenn, thank